All right, so today we're going to talk about someone else's problem, SEP. We're going to talk about how it's got badness to it, and most people think it's bad, but on the other hand, there are cases where SEP can really help somebody stay organized and stay focused. So it kind of depends on the situation you're in, but we'll talk about it anyway. And so what is SEP? It's the notion that something that came up is someone else's problem. It's outside your scope. And I was really thinking about this more in a software project point of view, but some people also use it for problem finding, right? And so I'll probably talk about both for each one of these, right? So the first one is SEP a lot of times can be used as an avoidance tool. Man, I found this leaky pipe and it's really not my thing. I'm not in the physical plant, so it's not my job to worry about it. And, someone else's problem that there's a leak here, right? And so that would be like a maintenance or ongoing thing. If you were in a new project or if you're in a software project, it would be, hey, we looked at this and the interface this other team provides is totally inadequate or it provides bad data. You know what? Not really my problem. If the project has an issue, it's their fault for not building a better one, right? And so in that case, both of those cases, SEP leads to issues. It could cause problems. And so a lot of times people will avoid the notion of SEP altogether. You know what? But so let's talk about when SEP can go for good, and then we'll come back to nothing as SEP. So I've also seen it where we used SEP in a project, and we used it to try and figure out, is this something we should worry about, or should we be somebody else's problem? Now, in our case, we didn't just ignore it. It wasn't like the Douglas Adams things where if it's someone else's problem, you walk by the body on the street and assume somebody will call the cops, right? This is something different. It's, hey, I recognize there's a problem. I am going to at least get it in front of the right people. I'll add it to my backlog to know that we actually did this. And then we'll assume that they'll take over from there. But in the case of the software projects I've on, we actually handled this in a Scrum of Scrums kind of thing, right? It was like, hey, these are all the SCPs we created, and what do they look like? So in our case, every time we looked at a project, when we were looking at grooming something or trying to understand what work needed to be done, it was either our problem or SEP, and we tagged it as such. And then we tagged, and then we, like I said, we annotated whose problem it became, and then did we hand it over to them? So that's the case where SEP can be good. You can use it to maintain focus. Is this SEP? Yes, not my problem. Get in front of another team, and then it's their thing to track, right? And assume they're going to do their job, or monitor it with like a Scrum of Scrums. Now, there is a whole nother school, and I think this is really around SEP as avoidance, right? Or SEP as the bystander effect. And that's nothing as SEP. And that can also be called, sometimes you'll hear it called, everything is your problem, or you found it, you own it, right? So I actually worked for somebody like this, and every time you found something, actually I've worked for two people like this, every time you found something, you owned it. It was your problem and you needed to fix it. And the notion was, if you found it, you were smart enough to fix it. Now, obviously that doesn't always make sense, right? Like, I found a gas leak. That doesn't mean I should be out trying to fix the gas line, right? And I'm picking a really simple one. I found my car has a problem. That doesn't mean I'm the right person to solve it, right? So it kind of depends on whether you have skill sets or there's experts that actually own that part. But that one is, you build it, you own it. And there can be, that can go really well, right? Then in that way, there's never an avoidance. Somebody always owns everything. The only downside I found is, like I said, I was in an area where we didn't always have the expertise. And if you found it, you owned it. And what it meant was nobody raised any issues. Our system looked great. But in the end, there were all these problems because you knew not to bring something up because you were busy and you didn't have any time to handle it. So, to net this out, right? I think we do SEP in our heads, but really, maybe it makes sense to do it explicitly. Hey, as we run across things or we're planning something, so one's reactive and one's proactive, as we run by stuff, is this our problem? Is it someone else's problem? Do we not, if it's in the gap between two different teams or two different groups, does that mean we really should own it? Or do we just drop it and, assume somebody else will walk by and smell gas, right? So I guess the net of this is, think about SEP as a technique, not just as a work avoidance. And think about what it means when you declare something, if you go with the nothing as SEP approach. How do you encourage people and make them successful and keep everybody engaged, that all problems are everybody's problems? So there's a couple different ways to go with this. I don't know what'll work for you, but try it out, or one of them out anyway. Have a great day.